Hello, I'm Breach Burke from Transition Life Coaching, and this is a video about the Archangel Azrael and my connection to Azrael. I wanted to make this video because, and I am going to be putting this as a standalone video on YouTube, so some people who are not looking at my new website or accessing this video through my website may see this. And I think it's an opportunity to talk a little bit about the kind of work that I do in transition life coaching and where Azrael fits into that, or how I use, or not really use, but how Azrael works with me or through me to do the kind of work that I do. Now, first of all, it's just to people who don't know me. I mean, I do have a little bio on my website, but I've been doing a variety of different things over the last, let's just say 37 years. Back when I was in high school, I started doing oracle card readings, tarot card readings, and got my first deck, Murray Hope's Way of Cartouche deck, which I use on the channel, on the Liminal Tarot channel, as my regular deck, and I always clarify with a tarot deck or something similar, because over the years I've become familiar with a lot of different systems, different oracles, runes, just a wide variety of decks that I use depending on the type of questions that I have. Some decks are better for day-to-day kind of queries, like, am I going to get another job, or, how's this relationship going to work out, or what's the outlook for this or that. And then there's other types of cards that are better for, I'm anxious and I'm trying to get behind why that is, or I'm going through a change and I'm not really sure if I'm approaching this in the right way, or we wake up, whatever kind of feelings we're going through, or whatever situations we're running into, or maybe we're meeting a challenge or conflict. Oftentimes those are cards that will tell us. I use, like, for example, the Osho Zen Tarot, which will tell you a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes psychologically, and how you can actually straighten that out and work that out. So, I've been doing that for a number of years. I'm also an academic. I have 3 postgraduate degrees, 2 masters and a doctorate, and my background for most of my life was as a librarian. My first degree was in library service. Now they'll say library science, that's the stock name of the degree, but when I went, it was the Master of Library Service still, and I was an expert in systems, tech services, metadata, classification. Weirdly enough, right? You would look at me and think, hey, you're doing tarot, what would you be involved with all that logical, analytical stuff? But I was. That was my career for years. And in fact, I taught it at Rutgers University for about 7 years. I taught cataloging, classification, and occasionally, very occasionally, library automation. So that was my life for a lot of years until 2019, when I did my last system migration. I should know better. I should have known better, because every time I do a system migration, everything just explodes in my life. And I literally had a nervous breakdown driving. Those of you from New Jersey, I was driving on the Garden State Parkway, leaving Teaneck and heading towards Montclair. And all of a sudden, I just froze. Like, I couldn't go above like 35 miles an hour. And that was terrifying, because I managed to get off at Route 46, which is a little bit slower of a road. But I was driving. My heart was pounding. I was like breaking out in a rat. I was terrified. And subsequently, this wasn't a one-time thing. This became a pattern. And I'd been to doctors. Doctors had tried me on different medications and things. The bottom line is that there's no medications that work. There's nothing that takes that anxiety away when it hits. There's things that sometimes will work, sometimes, but not all the time. So it's a bit of a crapshoot. What I've found is that when we had COVID and we all were home and couldn't drive anywhere, which to me, COVID was horrible, but that aspect of it was a blessing, because I could stay at home and I could work from home. And when I went around and I was, the driving that I had to do, there was nobody on the road, so I was able to improve slowly, and I got to a point where I felt pretty comfortable again. But then once I had to go back to work 5 days a week, I broke down again, and I started having panic attacks again. And that's when I made the decision that, okay, the body is telling me that it doesn't want to do this anymore, and it's time to leave this job. Now, I think it's even further than that. I think it's also time for me to leave this country because I've been trying to move to England for a very long time. But that's not something you can just make a decision to do and do it. The whole idea of visas and immigration stuff are very complicated. And unless you have a lot of money, initially I had a fair amount of money where I was able to live over there for 6 months and then come back. That would be the only legal way to do it right now. So, short of getting a job or marrying somebody. So it's very, I feel like the reason the driving problem continues for me is because something is saying inside me, don't get comfortable here. We don't want you to stay here. And I'm like saying to my guides, okay, but then you've got to give me the means to move. It's not, I even had psychics over in Ireland tell me, oh, well, you just got to get up and do it. And I'm like, no, it's not a matter of motivation. It's a matter of what's legal. I really don't want to be going to a country illegally. And, like I said, I could go and stay for long periods of time if I had the money, but money is always, when you're doing things on your own in this way, some months are good and some aren't. So, so it's an interesting thing. I had this, speaking of transformations, I talk a lot about transformation, and I have a lot of personal experience with transformations and with these kinds of changes that go on. But for a long time, people who know me from the Katonia podcast and the Katonia website, I have books, I have publications, I have all kinds of things at katonia.net. If you are watching this on Liminal Tarot, I'll have a link to that in the description below. And even if you're coming from my website, I do have links to Katonia on the transitionlifecoaching.net website. And I also have it in, again, you can look at it in the YouTube description as well. But that is the main thrust of my work. And a lot of it deals more with what we call the Chthonic rather than the celestial. Now, what does the word Chthonic mean? Well, Chthonic has to do with the earth and what's under the earth. So with the underworld, the old school underworld, Hades and things like that. Now, modern parlance tends to think of it as hell, but that's literally the whole point of my thesis, is that, that we associate the celestial very positively with the masculine, and we associate the earth very negatively with hell and the feminine. Those two things become lumped together. And I've often felt, well, yeah, there's a correlation there. There's something about the feminine as being connected to the sensual and to the erotic, and to all of these elements that make the feminine demonized in a lot of ways, rather than integrated. And I've done some podcasts recently about integrations of masculine and feminine, or where the initial split occurred, and why that split still seems like something that's a real problem to people. But that's always been my main focus. And that's what when I did my doctorate, that was what my doctoral dissertation was on. That's what my book, Death and the Maiden, the curious relationship between the fear of the feminine and the fear of death, that's what that book is connected to, is my doctoral work in that area. So point being is that I have a strong academic background. I still teach. I'm still, have a university, thing. I still have the mindset of, well, we've got to analyze and look at evidence and, and all of those kinds of things. So I feel that I don't want to say that I'm unique among spiritual counselors for that, because there's a lot of spiritual coaches and counselors who are just as grounded. But I feel that my approach tries to combine elements of analysis. I don't dive off the deep end conspiracy theory and things like that myself. But although if people are that's what they're feeling and believing, then obviously as a spiritual coach, it's not my job to judge where people are. Okay, so but at the same time, the idea is to try to steer people on a path that's going to be constructive for them, that's going to get them to where they feel they need to authentically be. And as I mentioned on my website, a lot of the problem that we have is not so much with death itself. We may go through a change or a loss, but really the problem isn't so much, the loss itself can be an issue, and we have to deal with that. But then there's also what comes after. We may end something. Let's just say we end a toxic relationship, and it's a relief to actually get out of it. But then it's like, okay, we're still dealing with all the fallout of what that relationship did to us. And then the question is, well, what's next? What's new? Is it going to be a new relationship? What direction does my life take now? That's a lot of the question. A lot of it has to do with where we're going, not with where Not necessarily with the actual change itself. I mean, change itself can be shocking and upsetting and traumatizing, but sometimes it's something that is a natural ending. We know it's an ending, but then we don't know what's next. So this is what they call being in a liminal space. That's where I use the term liminal a lot. It's like you're being on the boundary. You're between this and that, and in a certain sense, you're neither. You can't necessarily go back to where things were, but you don't necessarily know where you're going forward yet. And this can leave us in a very, very anxious kind of a state. Now, again, so my work, psychologically speaking, because a lot of my work is in psychoanalysis, has to do with the fact that we are dealing with the underworld, okay? And when we talk about the underworld in psychoanalysis, we're talking about what's in the collective unconscious. We're talking about archetypal stuff that impinges and affects our lives. But it does so because it's trying to tell us about things that are either going on with our body or things that are going on, areas where we may be stressed or repressing our energy or doing things. It comes out often in dreams, which is why I do a lot with dream work for people. So when we have this issue with dreams and dream work, which is really the language and the kind of a bridge that we have between those realms for us, although a lot of us are not trained to look at our dreams, or we look at them as superficial, or we attribute them to something chemical. I mean, and some dreams do have a chemical origin. There are people who will say take certain vitamins or something and end up with nightmares. So, for example. So, there can be a component there, but it's not it's most definitely not an entirely chemical phenomenon. There's something that's going on, and oftentimes these dreams are there to point us to what's happening. Now, so what I wanted to talk about in this video is Archangel Azrael. And this, for people who have known me in my work for a long time, might be surprised by this, because I've never done angelic work. That's not been my thing. I know about angelic work. I've worked with something called Enochian magic in the past, and Enochian calls. And that I did probably 10 years ago. I did a whole, what they call a working in that, where you basically are contacting angels of different realms and what they call aethers, and receiving information from them. And so I've done this. I've actually done a couple of different workings, but that was about as far as my angelic work went, because I felt like a lot of etheric work, at least in translation, just seemed to be very condemning of the earth. And I just thought, well, that's not how I roll. I'm not somebody who condemns the earth or anything about it. I think, we need to value the earth, and we need to value that the way in which nature and the feminine and all of those other faculties that we have as humans that we ignore, we need to focus on integrating those and getting away from being so cerebral, because being so much in our head all the time, we're always either in a state of always worrying about the past, always worrying about the future, and always analyzing everything to death and doubting everything that we do every step of the way. And this is not living life. This is us doubting life at every turn. So the question is, how do you get beyond that? And it's not an easy answer. It's a process that you need to go through, and it could be a lifelong process, but that is the culture that we live in. Now, when I encountered Azrael, the first time I encountered Azrael was when I was doing a working on soul names. Okay, and I had done, and so you go through this working where you basically go and do a meditation and find out, what your soul name is. And the name that came to me was Azrael. And I thought, my first thought, because my mind wasn't really in angelology, was, if you ever saw the Smurfs cartoon from the 80s, it was, the Gargamel, who was the bad guy, his cat's name was Azrael. And that's all I thought about. I was like, Azrael, the cat? I'm a cat person. So that was my first thought. And then I was like, no, wait, Azrael's an angelic name. And I looked it up, and that's when I said, oh, Azrael's angel of death. And then I thought, okay, well, that makes sense, given that a lot of my work is focused on the underworld. It's focused on people's transitions. Transition life coaching is something that's been around since 2021. And so my work has been in helping people transition, and not necessarily through, I'm not somebody who can transition someone through physical death. That would obviously be the purview of someone like, a being like Azrael, or similar, what they call psychopomp type being. But so yeah, so Azrael, so I mean, the connection there kind of made sense. The fact that it was one of my soul names I thought was interesting, and just to be clear, that doesn't mean that I'm Azrael. It means that my soul, I'm part of a soul group that where Azrael is sort of the connecting factor or the origin. So therefore, the kind of work I do is connected to Azrael. It makes sense. But what I did not expect to happen was really very beginning of this year, I started having dreams. And these were not ordinary dreams. They weren't just dreams about stuff going on in my life, where my subconscious or unconscious is trying to tell me things. These were dreams in which I encountered Azrael in 3 different forms. And I don't necessarily want to get into what all of them are in detail, but the first one is what I would call numinous, meaning it didn't really have a form, but was more of a presence. And numinous presences are terrifying. They're not evil, but they're just terrifying, because you are literally knowing you are encountering something that is different from you. And it is a very, when we talk about the sacred versus the profane, this is a highly sacred and maybe taboo kind of force. You feel it kind of coming at you. The second time I saw Azrael in the form of an animal. And then the third time I saw Azrael in the form of a person, kind of in a form that we might expect, with black wings. The one thing about Azrael all the time is the idea of shielding your eyes from Azrael, or him veiling his face so that you don't see him directly. And he had said to me at one point, I have looked Azrael in the face, but then he would kind of cover his face and say, you don't want to look directly in my face, because it's not healthy to do that for a long period of time. But that said, Azrael is there. I feel that now my work is very much connected to Azrael's. Azrael is here to, there's a whole lot of transition that is going on in people's personal lives and collectively. And he is here to try to help people move into this, really almost acting maybe more as a midwife or a doula rather than a death angel. Although really, in a certain sense, when one thing dies, another thing is born. And so he's there to try to have this work of trying to help people establish the endings that need to be established and move towards where they need to go next. So trying to help people through that gap. That's the kind of work Azrael does. And that's the kind of work that he seems to want to do through me. Again, this is very unexpected. I've had people tell me in the past that I have mediumistic abilities. I've never really considered myself a medium, and because I tend to be so analytical and cerebral, maybe it's just something that has a hard time coming through because I don't yield to it very easily. But it's just, this is something that's more spontaneous. It just comes up and it happens. And so I was given the message that I need to incorporate this into my transition life coaching work. So, and again, it was something I was a little this way and that way about, because I thought, well, is this the kind of thing that I should be sharing openly? But it's sort of like, well, yeah, that's why I'm here. I'm here, not just here for me. He's here for trying to help people work through their changes, because right now, even if you want to get away from the idea of physical death, which is not all what it's all about. I mean, we make other transitions. Like I said, we may be living lives that we realize don't really resonate with who we are. We may be in relationships that we realize just make us feel dead inside, or that just whatever they might have been in the past, they're not anymore. There's all kinds of situations where we need to accept the loss and move on. And it's not very easy for us to do that. So the work that I do, it falls into 2 camps. I have a link in my site for spiritual coaching, and spiritual coaching is just that can be very practical. That can be, okay, you're looking for a new job, and let's sit down and look at what your options are. Remember, I was a librarian for years, and even though as a tech librarian, one of the things I do know is classification and taxonomy, so I know how to search for these things. I know how to look for them and to help people find information, or to point them to the right resources for what they're doing. You can talk about more practical techniques for managing stress. You can talk about more practical techniques for You've moved house. Okay, so how do you figure out, what to do now that you're in your neighborhood? How do you, if your finances are a worry, how do you create a budget? There's some very practical things that I can do and do with people. And we often start with the practical. Let's start on the practical level. With certain goals or certain changes that are going on, because oftentimes we need something to ground us in where we are now. But beyond that, there are people who want to work. It's like, okay, that's all settled. Now I'm working in, I can, something is transforming that's on a much bigger scale. And they say, okay, I want to close up those old loops, finish those old patterns, whether they're ancestral, whether they have to do with past lives or concurrent lives, if you look at it in that way, if you take the time factor out of it. How do we pull all the different elements of ourselves together in like a soul retrieval to make sure that all the pieces of us are working in harmony and that we're not fragmented and that elements of us maybe in other lifetimes are not impacting us now. There's a bleed through of some kind, or that we're just not picking up other people's emotions, that we're sort of integrated. We know where everybody is and everything is, and we're kind of working from that space. And and that would also for me include some works that I know, again, I'm using them because I know they work. I have experience with them. Cord cutting work. And I do cord cutting not just between people. I also do cord cutting for habit patterns and things like that. I mean, that is something that you can do and that does work. It may not, it doesn't necessarily take care of everything immediately, but it starts the process of breaking things down. And also sometimes when somebody is, waiting for a transition to happen of any kind, sometimes what they need is I create grids and I create portals that are for that person that will kind of open up the pathway or the gateway to the next phase that they're going into. And I don't just mean people who are dying. I mean people who are okay, I've been doing this for years. Now I'm going to pick up and move and go somewhere else and start a new life, and that kind of change too. Because every time you change, I refer to it as a little death, which I realize is not a term that is endearing to everybody, but it is a kind of a mini death because you are not the same person that you were. So that person is not there anymore, and now there's a new person. It's still you, but there's an aspect of you that's transformed, that's different. So we look at it from that perspective, and a lot of times, especially in certain cases, Azrael may want to come through, and we want to have a session where he is the one to kind of guide you on the steps in your life with regard to something bigger, something having to do with not only your purpose, but the context of you in the broader scheme of things, in the broader culture and the broader society. So so that's how I've ended up working with Azrael, and it's something that I am I'm used to a certain degree at this point, but it's something that's there's something new every day with it. So but I have found it to be a really transformative experience. And one of the things, at least personally for me working with Azrael, is that certain habit patterns that I have had from childhood, certain scripts that I've played over and over again, now I finally have the means to release those like permanently. And that has been really, that's been really a great thing. That's been really a good thing for me. I feel very, I'm very lucky in the sense that there's been sort of an accelerated development here, and I've been able to push past a lot of attitudes and behaviors and things that have been very limiting to me and have been blocking me from where it is that I want to go. So a lot of potential with that kind of work. But as always, when I do coaching, I'm going to use the elements that people are comfortable with, and I'm going to be using the elements that are relevant to whatever that person is going through or whatever reason they've come to work with me. And obviously, if people are not comfortable with those elements, then we don't have to use them. I don't, we just use whatever people, because the idea is that I'm here primarily to really be a supplement to somebody's therapist. I'm somebody here to, and also, but people who are more on a kind of transformative journey. And it's like, okay, let's look at the elements of the transformation. Let's look at where you've been. Let's look at where you're going. And I do things by the hour. It's just easier for me than trying to say this service is this much, this service is this much. It's just, it's for my time. It's an hour, and see, what we get done in an hour, with the exception of my life assessment, which is which is more expensive because it is a much more involved process. It involves me making 3 or 4 different charts, plus I'm doing readings for you, plus I'm doing Reiki therapy, plus I'm providing other resources, and so that's like a 3-hour job. So that's why that one is different and more than the others. But most of my work, it's just kind of by the hour. But the idea is that it's not necessarily a one-shot deal where you meet with me once and that's the end of it. We're getting involved in a process of working together. Now, again, that said, that doesn't mean people need to be working with me forever and ever. Obviously, there's usually an upper limit, at which point you get to a point where you say, okay, I'm ready to just continue doing this on my own. And that's the way it should be, actually. People shouldn't, I'm not there to tell anybody what to do with their life. But as a coach, my job is to try to help you facilitate figuring out where you're going, helping you interpret the signs along the way through a variety of methods. So, if you've been watching this on YouTube and haven't seen my website, please check out transitionlifecoaching.net. Again, link in the description below. If you are looking at this from my website, then I hope that this video was informative, not too rambly. I like to keep things informal. And do check out my Liminal Tarot channel if you have not, just to see how I read and do readings. Although the readings that I do on that channel are not the psychological readings that I do, which are a bit different in their content. But you can see the kind of experience that I have with cards and with stuff like that. And also, and I also have some testimonials and things on my page, so you can see other people who have worked with me and what they think. So, so I hope this video answers some of your questions. Always feel free to email me at transitionlifecoaching22, one word, at gmail.com. And I'm happy to address any questions that you have. Thanks so much for watching.